Hi, I'm Father Patrick Cheng, and I'm an Episcopal priest and a visiting professor at Episcopal Divinity School at Union. In this video, I'd like to talk to you about queer Anglicanism, 500 years in 15 minutes. So what exactly is queer Anglicanism? Well, a brief definition is that it's about the history and contributions of same-sex attracted and gender variant individuals in the Church of England, the Episcopal Church, and the wider Anglican Communion from the 16th century until today. And in this video, I use the term same-sex attracted and gender variant because our traditional terms such as LGBTQ weren't even invented or constructed until the 19th century. There are a lot of definitions about the term queer, from umbrella term to reclaiming power, transgression, non-identity. But here we're really going to be looking at queer as a non-binary term that is resisting binaries such as male or female, or even gay or straight. And in many ways, the Anglican Communion resists binaries between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. So we begin with the 16th century and the founding of the Church of England, or the separation of the Church of England from the Roman Catholic Church by Henry VIII through the 1534 Act of Supremacy. The English Reformation differed from many other Reformations to the extent that it was grounded in sexuality, that Henry VIII wanted his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled, and therefore the Reformation was a way for achieving that and allowed Henry subsequently to have 5 other marriages. Also, during the English Reformation, the first Anti-Sodomy statute, the Buggery Act of 1533, was adopted by Parliament, which Henry used to shut down Roman Catholic religious orders and monasteries and to take their wealth. And so the sodomy statute, anti-sodomy statute, was actually used in an economic and political way. Queen Elizabeth I was also queer to the extent that the Elizabethan Settlement was a resistance of the binaries between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. Also in terms of gender, Elizabeth I was seen to be masculine to the extent that as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, she never married, never had children. And her successor, James I, was actually seen as feminine, even though he was married to a woman. He was known for his queenie behavior, for lack of a better word, for his flirtations with his male courtiers and favorites. I love this contemporaneous Latin saying, Rex fuit Elizabeth, nunc est regina Jacobus. Elizabeth was king, now James is queen. In the 17th century, we have an interesting writing from Bishop Jeremy Taylor, a Caroline divine, called The Discourse on the Nature and Offices of Friendship, which was a letter that he wrote to Katherine Ph. Phillips was a famous poet and a lesbian, thought to engage in sapphic relationships. And she had asked Bishop Taylor about how far friendships can go. And so he clearly understood what was going on. And it was very much a pastoral letter. And it's an interesting work to think about because there is this undertone of same-sex relationships in this pastoral advice that Bishop Taylor is giving to Catherine Phillips. Also in the 17th century, you have the execution of Bishop Atherton, a bishop in Ireland. And it's said, though, that even though he did engage in same-sex acts and his lover, John Child, as you can see in this woodcut, was also executed. But it is said that in large part, it was due to other political and other power-based issues as opposed to just sodomy. In the 18th and 19th centuries, you have the issue of empire and the growth of the British Empire and imperialism. As you can see in this map here, this is sort of the height of the British Empire with all the different colonies and places around the world in which it controlled from Great Britain. And the issue of colonialism and the racialized other, this excerpt from a 19th century map, you can see Britannia sitting on top of the world, Britannia representing Great Britain, surrounded by people of color in terms of the colonies. And this whole idea of othering people, noting people as the racialized other as a means of power and control, that is at the heart of colonialist thinking. And not only the racialized other, but also the sexualized other. This discourse of racialist and racist stereotypes abounded, as in the book Colonialism and Homosexuality says that very much there were wild fantasies and homoerotic writing and art about foreign men and race-based stereotyping, stereotypes that still occur to this day. So in many ways, the British Empire used race as well as sexuality. This is what we have in terms of queer post-colonial thought as a means of controlling the foreign other. And these stereotypes remain to this day. And also, even though the British explorers were using the colonies as their own sexual playgrounds, they also passed many anti-sodomy laws, that many of which remain today. And there is a legacy of the British anti-sodomy laws, which were actually even stronger than the anti-sodomy laws of other imperial powers, including France. Also during the 19th century was the rise of ritualism and the role of Roman Catholicism. Here you see a political cartoon where it makes fun of the return to Roman Catholic liturgy. You see the priest holding up a pig's head and having a meal at the altar. So making fun of, sort of the pagan nature of Anglo-Catholic worship, if you will. There was also an anxiety about Anglo-Catholicism and masculinity. In this political cartoon, you see women and this girl coming in dressed in vestments, which are not surprising in the Episcopal Church today in terms of women priests, deacons, and bishops. But this was supposed to be a shocking political cartoon in terms of the feminization of religion due to Anglo-Catholic practices. And then another political cartoon where one ritualist is saying to another, oh, Athanasius is charmingly becoming, sort of wearing feminine clothing in terms of liturgical dress. So again, there's an undercurrent of anti-queer, anti-masculine or masculine sort of issues in terms of Anglo-Catholicism. And what's interesting is that John Henry Newman, Cardinal Newman, was one of the founders of the Oxford movement, wished and was in fact buried with his longtime companion. In his will, he wrote, "I wish with all my heart to be buried in Father Ambrose St. John's grave, and I give this as my imperative will." So you can see the tombstone for Cardinal Newman, who was buried with Father Ambrose St. John until he was exhumed by the Roman Catholic Church and made a saint recently. And then in the early 20th century, this book by Derek Sherwin Bailey, an Anglican priest, called Homosexuality in the Western Christian Tradition, was a very important turning point in terms of queer Anglicanism. Bailey questioned the traditions of the religious roots of anti-queer thinking and looked at the texts of Terre, the traditional anti-LGBT texts in scripture, and argued that it had been based in a misreading. And that in fact, anti-sodomy laws should be, the criminalization of same-sex behavior should be repealed. And in fact, the Wolfenden Report did recommend in September of 1957 that homosexual behavior between consenting adults in private should no longer be considered a criminal offense. And so there were Anglo-Catholics, there were Anglican priest and a professor of moral pastoral theology sitting in the Wolfenden committee that made this recommendation. And interestingly, did not take effect for a few years, but the United States was even later before criminal sodomy laws were repealed and ruled as unconstitutional by the US Supreme Court. And so, as I mentioned, during this time in the 50s, there was a re-examination of the texts of Terre, the texts that are used to argue against same-sex and gender variant behaviors, such as Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. The re-examination of these scriptural passages, for example, with Sodom and Gomorrah, argued that the sin of Sodom was really about inhospitality and rape, as opposed to same-sex behaviors. And then in the 1960s, you began to have voices of clergy allies speaking out. The Council on Religion and the Homosexual was founded in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1960s, included an Episcopal cleric. And also in the 1960s, you had the writing of a lay theologian, William Stringfellow, who was a lawyer, Harvard-trained lawyer, who turned to theology and was actually acknowledged by Karl Barth as an important theologian. Stringfellow had a lifelong companion, Anthony Towne, who died, and Stringfellow wrote about his love for Towne. And in addition to Stringfellow, Malcolm Boyd was a prominent Episcopal priest, Diocese of Los Angeles, who wrote a very important book, Are You Running With Me, Jesus? Prayers by Malcolm Boyd, that had a prayer in terms of finding Jesus in a gay bar. In the 1970s, saw the formation and rise of Integrity, the advocacy organization of the Episcopal Church, working for the full inclusion of all the baptized and all the sacraments, founded by Louie Clay. Louie Clay was an important advocate, a layperson in the Diocese of Newark in terms of equality, founded Integrity because he called up Grace Cathedral in San Francisco in the early 70s and wanted to know where he could meet other gay Episcopalians, and he was actually laughed, the receptionist laughed at him, and that prompted him to found Integrity. Also in the 1970s was the first ordination of an open lesbian, Ellen Barrett, now Sister Helena Barrett. And Ellen Barrett was ordained by Bishop Paul Moore in the Diocese of New York. Paul Moore was known as a progressive bishop. Turns out, though, that he was closeted. In a book by his daughter, Honor Moore, talks about Paul Moore's long-term relationship with another man. And since then, also ways in which he had exploited his power. And so many of these issues had come to light subsequent to his death. Also in 1977 was the ordination of Pauli Murray, the first African-American woman to be ordained an Episcopal priest. And in Pauli Murray's writings, Dr. Murray writes about Dr. Murray's own wrestling with transgender identity, as well as Murray's long-term relationship with Renee. And so Pauli Murray is, there's been a resurgence of Murray studies, including the founding of a new residential college at Yale University. Also in 1970s, the 1979 General Convention marked a high point in terms of the first resolution that spoke positively about homosexual persons. It is the sense of this General Convention that homosexual persons are children of God who have a full and equal claim with all other persons upon the love, acceptance, and pastoral concern and care of the Church. So that was an important resolution, even though it still affirmed, General Convention affirmed that same-sex behaviors were not permitted, not normative, and certainly not appropriate for ordained persons for quite a while after this. In the 1980s, you saw the Episcopal Church's response to the HIV/AIDS pandemic, the National Episcopal AIDS Coalition. And also in the 1980s, you saw the ordination of the first openly gay man who was in a relationship, Robert Williams, who was ordained in the Diocese of Newark. He wrote a book called Just As I Am, A Practical Guide to Being Out, Proud, and Christian. Williams was ordained by Bishop John Shelby Spong, the Bishop of Newark, a maverick, an ally of LGBT folks. But shortly after ordaining Williams, there was a falling out. You see this New York Times article, Ouster of a Gay Priest, Who Betrayed Whom? Spong was very upset that Williams had spoken critiquing celibacy and Mother Teresa. And Williams ended up leaving the Episcopal Church, died shortly thereafter of HIV/AIDS. And Spong, though, continued to be an advocate of lesbian and gay persons in terms of ordinations in the Diocese of Newark. Carter Hayward, who was one of the Philadelphia 11, one of the first women to be ordained to the priesthood in the Episcopal Church, was a lesbian, graduate of Union Theological Seminary. Her very important book, Touching Our Strength, The Erotic is Power and Love of God, was the grounding of erotic theology, sexual theologies in the late 1980s. And Hayward wrote about Christa, the feminine Christ. And in the 1990s, you had the Episcopal heresy trial, a heresy trial of Walter Reiter, who was an assistant bishop to Bishop Spong after he had retired as a bishop of Iowa. And Walter Reiter was presented with a presentment in terms of ordaining an openly gay man as an Episcopal deacon, Barry Stopfel. And he went through this heresy trial, and the opinion was announced in May of 1996, where he was acquitted. The court for a trial of bishop concluded that there was no violation of what it called core doctrine. And so basically, in terms of this heresy trial for Bishop Ryder was held not to have violated the canons of the Episcopal Church in terms of ordaining an openly gay practicing homosexual, that was not a core doctrine. That was more, core doctrine would be doctrine relating to the Nicene Creed and the ancient beliefs of the church. The 1998 Lambeth Conference also occurred during this decade. This was the conference that was notorious in terms of the fight between the global South and the global North over homosexuality, and in particular Lambeth Resolution 110, which remains to this day the official statement of the Anglican Communion on same-sex relationships. As you can see from the New York Times, the headline was "Anglican Conference Takes Tough Line on Homosexuals." Lambeth Resolution 110 states that marriage is between a man and a woman, and also refuses to recognize the ordination of individuals in same-sex relationships. But at the same time, during the 90s, you had the emergence of LGBTQ voices of color, priests such as Lang Lim, Renee Hill, and Horace Griffin in the Episcopal Church began writing about their experiences as both queer and people of color. The main issues in the 2000s was the consecration of Bishop Gene Robinson as the Bishop of New Hampshire. But before the Robinson consecration, the 2000 General Convention actually acknowledged post-Lambeth 98 that there were other relationships. They acknowledged that there were currently couples and other lifelong committed relationships that were not marriage, and acknowledged that these relationships could be holy, especially those that were characterized by fidelity, monogamy, mutual affection and respect, careful, honest communication, and holy love, in which the partners see each other in the image of God, and also denouncing promiscuity, exploitation, and abusiveness. So it's very important to recognize that in 2000, General Convention recognized that there were other relationships other than marriage. 2003 saw the election and consecration of Bishop Gene Robinson, which led to schism in many parts of the Anglican Communion, separation of dioceses within the Episcopal Church, as well as a great breaking down of relationships within the Anglican Communion. And the Windsor Report, which was commissioned by the primates in 2004, was an attempt to try to bring the Anglican Communion back together or prevent it from just splitting up. And one of the things that the Windsor Report suggested was a proposed Anglican covenant that would result in a more centralized governance of the Anglican Communion. And that was the final text of the proposed Anglican covenant was made in 2009. And in 2008, you had another Lambeth Conference in which Gene Robinson was actually not invited. All the Anglican bishops in the world were invited except for Gene Robinson. So you see him standing next to this welcome sign. And also during the 2000s, you saw the existence of property litigation in the Episcopal Church. A lot of the breakaway dioceses wanting to retain their property, saying that it was really the Episcopal Church that had left the church and the Anglican Communion because of its heretical teachings. In the 2010s, you saw many developments, including the consecration of Mary Glasspool in 2010. For a while, the Episcopal Church had put a moratorium on the consecration of openly lesbian gay bishops, but this was lifted in 2009 in Anaheim, and so Bishop Glasspool was consecrated in 2010. Also, the Anglican Covenant was defeated in 2012. The Church of England itself refused to approve the Anglican Covenant. And during this decade, the Episcopal Church went to full sacramental marriage equality. First, it affirmed same-sex relationship rights, same-sex blessings. And then in 2015, General Convention allowed for same-sex marriage liturgies. but allowed certain dioceses to opt out due to conscience. But in 2018, General Convention required any diocese that wanted to opt out to invite a visiting flying bishop, if you will, to allow for such rights so that marriage equality would be available to all. And so in 2016, the primates meeting actually sanctioned the Episcopal Church to 3 years as a result or consequence of its marriage actions. This expired in 2019. The Episcopal Church was still part of the Anglican Communion, but was not allowed to take certain leadership or ecumenical roles. It's still playing out today, but again, these sanctions or consequences expired in 2019. Also, during the 2010s, you saw the rise of transgender and non-binary voices in General Convention and in the broader church in terms of resolutions, and also speaking recently to Executive Council. In the 2020s, you really saw issues of intersectionality in terms of queerness, but also race issues, Black Lives Matter, and in particular, the rise of intersectional and postcolonial voices. You saw the rise in writings of Anglican priests and lay persons, including Jarrell Robinson Brown in the Church of England, myself, Carla Roland Guzman, and Miguel Escobar in the Episcopal Church. The intersections of Anglicans of African descent, Asian Americans, Latinx folks in terms of the bridging of issues of race and sexuality. And again, perhaps this marks the beginning of a new via media in terms of finding via media between the binaries of race on the one hand and sexuality and gender on the other. Another development in the 2020s was the formation of the House of Deputies LGBTQ caucus. Unlike Integrity, which was outside of the legislative process, this caucus was made up of members of the House of Deputies. And this caucus has proposed legislation relating to LGBTQ individuals in the Episcopal Church to be brought to the 2022 General Convention in Baltimore. Also in 2022 was scheduled the Lambeth Conference of the Anglican bishops from around the world. Unlike the 2008 conference in which Gene Robinson was excluded from the conference, this time the bishops in same-sex relationships were invited, 4 from the United States, Bishops Glasspool, Brown, Perry, and Johnson, and 1 from the Anglican Church of Canada, Bishop Robertson. They were invited, but their spouses were not. And so this time there was a conference call of these bishops and the Archbishop of Canterbury in January of 2022. People don't know exactly what happened during this conference call, but as of now, the spouses are still not invited. And so the future, what the future brings for queer Anglicanism, no one knows. It is an unfolding story, but what we do know is that the story of queer Anglicanism is not a simple one. It is multi-dimensional, multi-layered, and we shall see what happens for the next 500 years. Thank you so much for your interest in this topic. And if you would like more information, please see my website at www.patrickcheng.net. There's information on queer Anglicanism as well as on queer theology and my own scholarship. Thank you, and please feel free to contact me through the website if you have any other questions. God bless.